Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Angelina Fabbro. I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Sunny Vancouver. It's actually not very sunny. And I work for a company called Steam Clock Software, and for the last couple of years I've been building mobile applications for native, for PhoneGap. I've used Objective-C, a lot of JavaScript. We've also done a couple web apps, and I work with some pretty talented and awesome people there. But if you talked to me yesterday, you got a bit of a spoiler, and that's that I'm joining Mozilla in early June to be working on Firefox OS. So that is what I do. The web is actually my first love. I've been making websites since I was really small. My first one was on AngelFire, which I mention sometimes. And it was about dolphins, and all it was basically animated GIFs of dolphins. So I like to think I've come a little bit farther since then. So a little bit about me. I am not a beginner at programming, but I'm not an expert. Like, I don't consider myself to be an expert at all. And so this talk is actually about trying to become an expert as someone who considers themselves an intermediate developer. We have a lot of resources and a lot of initiatives to get people started programming and to cater to beginner programmers. And until the last year or two, it was actually really hard to find articles and tutorial bits for people who are intermediate developers who think, oh, you know, I don't know, I'm writing code, but how do I make it better? You know? And so that's a little bit about what this talk is about. So the first things first, let's get a few cognitive biases out of the way, because I run into these sorts of ideas whenever I'm teaching or presenting, or when people come to me and they like sort of secretly disclose that they feel a bit insecure about their programming. You are not special. None of you. No. Neither is anybody else, so that's okay. We're all on the same page. I know your mom told you this when you were a kid, but this is actually a motivational anti-pattern. It works one of two ways. Either your mom tells you that you're totally special and you've got all this natural talent with the violin, and then maybe like you don't practice, and then all the other people who do sort of catch up and you don't feel so special anymore. Or you know, you think that maybe if someone else was told they're special, maybe you're not special. And so there's some like disparity between you and the special people, often the people we think who are experts. We think there's something very different about them from where we are. And so what I wanted to say is that nobody is born with natural talent. There are no natural born programmers. And whenever I say this, people get really, really emotional about this. And I mean really emotional, probably because their mom told them that they were special, or probably because if they are a good programmer, they like to pretend that they're special and that there's some natural talent. And there's a whole body of research out there. You are all smart individuals, so I will leave it up to you to do your own research and take a look. There is an interesting book called Outliers by, I think, Malcolm Gladwell. I really hope I got that right, that discusses this topic at length. Now, you are the result of many complicated interactions. Some of those things that can make you seem like a natural usually have to do with your early childhood education. The one thing that people like to glom onto really quickly is genetics and say like, oh, well, you know, maybe there's like a gene for programming or a gene for logical thinking. And I'm pretty sure that there are probably genes that we can identify. I mean, I know there's at least a few SNPs identified for nonverbal intelligence, for example. But it's not that simple. Our understanding of genetics has come a long way in the last 10, 20 years. And really the focus now is on epigenetics, the environmental pressures that affect gene expression. Because even if you have like the predisposition to, you know, unfortunately have cancer, you may not necessarily have cancer if, you know, if you take care of yourself, if the environmental pressures aren't there. And so it's a little bit nebulous to say that genetics are deterministic, because they just really aren't. Also, your early childhood exposure to logical thinking, whether or not you had that, early childhood practice of these logical skills, and the early framing of your relationship to logical thinking. A lot of people like myself who grew up in a fairly semi-rural area and didn't have a lot of positive programmer role models, like, you know, we were sort of told that, you know, if you like math and you like programming, well, that's never going to go anywhere. Why do you bother with those computers? And some people, get framed really early that math is going to be too hard for them or programming is going to be too hard for them. Well, I'm here to tell you today that nobody is a natural. And sorry, that's just another GIF about people not liking the logic of it. They feel like they're special. So your feelings don't matter here. In spite of popular beliefs, there's no one thing that you're destined to do. Purpose doesn't happen to you any more than love does. These things evolve when you commit yourself fully to something or someone and make the decision to work through the muck. So I wanted to say that yes, I mean programming and math and logical thinking can be a hard thing, but that every single person in this audience and their kids and their friends and anybody you meet is capable of programming. And there's so much bloody, problematic framing of this topic that it drives me up the wall. In 2006, Jeff Atwood posted a post, I guess. He made a post about a academic study, and I put that in quotes because while it was put out by an academic institution, anybody who's had any training in, anybody who's gone and done a little bit of grad school, anybody who's been involved with cognitive science and the behavioral sciences and done research design will read that paper and laugh. Because the research design was very poor, the sample size was very small, and what this study was trying to say was for students that come into our programming courses at our university, we can give them a test and we can we can predict how well they're going to do at the course, and we can then separate programmers from non-programmers. But that's really problematic because the way people interpreted this is the way the media often interprets things, and that's very sensational. And they started saying we've got a test now to tell natural programmers from non-programmers. And I was like, well, no. All this says is that someone can tell how well someone's going to do based on how they teach a course about programming, and also only considering the knowledge and experience they have with logical thinking up until that point, which you just don't know anything about. Maybe somebody didn't have a good relationship with math in school. Maybe someone else grew up with parents who were scientists and they just loved this stuff. And so I really think you should take all that stuff with a grain of salt because it's often framed in, like I say, a very problematic way. So nobody's special, and experts are not born with any natural talent, so that's out of the way. And that's actually really awesome. It's actually really empowering because that means that any of you have the capacity to take from where you are as a programmer and move towards expertise and move towards mastery and feel a lot more confident about the things that you do in your job or in your side projects. So if you practice logical thinking, and if you practice programming a lot, and you manage to absorb enough of the vast amount of domain knowledge that's out there, you too will become an expert. So that's pretty awesome. So then how do you know that you're not a beginner? So clue number one, I think, is that you can use the fundamentals in any language. So by fundamentals, I mean your basic control structures like loops, if-else statements, know how to do like variable assignments, know how to do some really basic operations and what the main operators are in a language. If you can kind of sit down with a new language and get out a hello world, or make a very small app without having to know the nuances of a language or framework, I think that you are a little bit beyond being a beginner. Clue number two, you are comfortable writing code from scratch. When people are beginners, there's definitely a pattern of they grab like a third-party library, like maybe jQuery as an example, and they're like, oh wow, I could do so much cool stuff with jQuery. But a lot of the time they'll like put jQuery in, and then they'll just put in a plugin and then not touch it. I mean, that's not really the same as programming, right? So I would say that someone who's a beginner, or just beyond being a beginner, is comfortable writing code from scratch and not just editing or gluing together the pieces that they find. And just to be perfectly clear, that is an important step. Like just being able to like get into the code and try reading it and edit it and play with it and copy and paste a little bit. That's actually an excellent transitional skill to becoming a better programmer, despite the fact that a lot of people are really against that. I think that that's perfectly fine for beginners. So if you're not a beginner, you're probably comfortable at least writing some code from scratch, whether it's a couple functions or a whole, like writing all your code to make your single page application work. Clue number three that you're not a beginner, when you do use something like jQuery, you peek inside because you want to know how it works. You may not necessarily understand all the things that are in there, but you are getting curious and you want to know, like, what's going on? Like, how does this iterator work? How does how does this selector stuff work? And you start getting in there, and even if you don't necessarily understand all of it, you're at least trying to. And number 4, you may feel like your code is mediocre and you don't really know what to do about it. And this is a really interesting one because people will not talk about this topic openly at events that I teach and talk at, but they'll come to me personally later on and they'll tell me, and it's very interesting because there's no real trend about gender or ethnic background or anything like that. It's literally all sorts of people will be like, hey, so I think you're good at JavaScript, they'll say. So I feel really mediocre. I feel like there's all this pressure for me to be really good, really fast, because it's a community of really smart people. And I'm like, well, I feel that. I feel you. I know them feels. And so if you have that feeling, you're not alone. And so those are some ways that you know that you are not a beginner. Well, how do you know that you're not an expert? Right? I mean, if you're not a beginner, maybe you're an expert. Clue number 1, you don't quite grok all the code you read, including comments. So maybe you do get into the jQuery source, and maybe there are some comments, but you still don't really understand what they're doing with bind, and you know that there's these things called call and apply, and you don't understand why there's 2 versions of what seems to be doing the same thing, and you start exposing yourself to some more higher level concepts this way. And so if you don't quite understand all those things you read, probably you're not quite an expert. Clue number 2 is that you can't explain what you know. Some people like to argue with me that there are plenty of competent developers that are awesome, but can't for the life of them explain their methodology or their practice or what they're coding to someone else. I think that this is a big problem, and even if you are further on other avenues of expertise, like maybe you do understand bind and call and apply, for example, but you can't explain what you know to someone in a patient and clear way, that's a shortcoming. And you need to get better at that because programmers need to be able to communicate and disseminate knowledge between one another and with their teams that they work with. And so clue number 3, you aren't confident debugging. This one for me took a long time for me to actually really get into the debugger in Chrome, and then when I'm working with Objective-C and in Xcode and stuff like that, and to develop sort of a mental model of how I could solve various problems with different debugging strategies rather than just doing this. I throw in some console logs all over the place, especially when I started using Node. I was a bit of a late adopter to Node, and I started realizing I was like, oh, this is why I need callbacks. Okay. I like that he just kind of stopped right there. And then clue number 4 is you rely on references too much. So it's really interesting that most of us who are employed as software engineers or web developers or whatever your title is, if you're writing code all day, probably you do have a tab open in your browser that is a language reference or a API reference of some sort, because to memorize all of this stuff is kind of crazy, and these things are changing constantly too. But I think that you should be writing a large amount of your code, for example, particularly vanilla JavaScript in this case, without necessarily needing to refer to a reference. I mean, if you need to once in a while, then that's fine. But I mean, you should probably aim to write as much with as little reference as possible. And the reason for this is just that you will probably accomplish more, honestly. You won't be stopping and getting derailed, and you can write code with confidence when you know and you've internalized those little bits. So if this describes you, if you are not a beginner and you are not an expert, welcome to the ambiguous zone of intermediateness. You are not alone. I am there with you. And so from going from there, what does a curriculum for mastery actually look like? And also, what makes a great programmer? And let's start with that second one. So it really depends who's asking. And this is a little bit of a quote written by a gentleman named Ed Weissman, whose writing I really, really love. He is well, I know that he's definitely older than I am, but he's got something like 30 or 40 years of experience, maybe more than that, in programming. And he's written actually a really interesting ebook that's great for programmers of all levels, but particularly if you're starting out. If you just Google Ed Weissman, you'll be able to find it. And I read this book, and it really got to me in a good way, because he answered a lot of sort of ideological questions about the field of programming that I'd been asking myself and questioning, like, do I want to keep doing this? Short answer, yes. So who is a good programmer? It depends who is asking. To a project manager, the programmer who hits every deadline regardless of quality is a good programmer. To the customer, the programmer who solves the problem the fastest is a good programmer. To the business owner, the programmer who makes them the most money is a good programmer. And to the junior programmer, the best mentor is a good programmer. And to another programmer, the programmer that they're most likely to want to go to battle with is a good programmer. So what do I need to learn to be an expert, and like how do you even do that? You know, what do? You want to feel unstuck. So I'm going to give you some suggestions here and a little bit of ideas for materials so that you too can transform yourself from being intermediate into being an expert. So suggestion number 1, please ask why obsessively, short of existential angst. Like all the time. I mean, I'm talking specifically about code right now, but I mean like just in general with your life. I mean, you can ask yourself like, why did I choose Eggs Benedict this morning? Why did I choose, better example, why did I choose to use jQuery? Like why did I want to do my, why did I choose like Twitter Bootstrap? Is it because I'm uncomfortable in the front end? Why did I choose Node.js to do all my server stuff? I mean, aside from it's really cool, everybody in this room probably really likes it, but like, why did you make that decision? Why did you use Express as your framework for your routes and all of that? So ask why obsessively to the point where you annoy yourself. It will give you a tremendous amount of self-awareness about the choices that you're making when you're doing development. So number 2, I really think that you should teach or speak at an event. There's this illusion that if you're standing up here that you're an expert. I like to think, like I say, I'm on my way to being an expert, but I'm definitely not an expert. The only thing you need to come up here and speak is an idea about something that you've made. And like the previous presentation where Remy was showing his experiment, that's a perfect example. If you've done something like that, you need to tell people about it and share the knowledge that you have with others. And what happens when you're teaching or speaking at an event is that you get to sort of formalize and sort of make the ideas that you have about what you've worked on a little bit more concrete. If you can communicate those effectively, you probably know the area pretty well. And when it comes to teaching, I teach at Ladies Learning Code, and I also do some stuff for Simon Fraser University. And that is super enlightening because it's a really good reflection on the kinds of assumptions you make about your own ability. For example, at Ladies Learning Code, I get people asking me questions like, well, okay, I've sort of worked ahead in the slides, and now I have this piece of code that I want to reuse. Should I copy and paste it? And I'm like, no, you shouldn't do that. You need functions. And people will often add or ask really, really compelling questions that cause you to realize, oh, I actually know a lot more than I thought about programming. So I also suggest working through a suggested curriculum of books. This is from John Ressig's website that he's had up for a little while called Learning Advanced JavaScript. And if you can go through this was sort of like a proposed curriculum for advanced JavaScript, which eventually evolved itself into this book, The Secrets of the JavaScript Ninja, which I think has a samurai on the front. And this book is really fantastic for me to read because I keep going through it. Oh, pardon me. I keep going through it and realizing there's a lot in that book that is totally rehashed for me and I already know. But there's a lot of stuff in there I don't know. So reading a book like this that has a comprehensive sort of outline of topics of mastery for JavaScript will help you reaffirm what you know and what you don't know. And that's a really good feeling, like to read through a book and be like, yeah, I got that. Or to discover that like you had no idea about function memoization. That totally blew my mind, for example. Experiment recklessly. The code doesn't care. This is suggestion number 4. The code does not care how old you are, who you are, where you came from, or anything like that. Nobody needs to see your code till you push it up to the branch that you need to push it to, or until you need to show it to someone else for code review. So experiment. Be reckless. Like do silly things just to see what happens. The code, it's just code. It's inert until you give it purpose. So number 5, you should have opinions. If you're progressing towards, I guess, an expert level of understanding and knowledge, you will probably naturally start to have opinions. Although it's really important to remember that when you're having opinions that, and you're trying to sort of cooperate with people, that you're going to run into people that you disagree with. And there's a little song that I like on the internet about that, and it goes something like this. It's okay to not like things, but don't be a jerk about the things you don't like. So just internalize that, please. I really like this one by Emily. Everybody, we're having opinions on things again. Don't forget to state yours as fact, or else you don't get to play. So just, you know, be reasonable and also accept that you could be wrong, and that being wrong is actually fantastic because there's an opportunity for learning there. So number 6, seek mentorship. If you're here, you're probably already in the right place, but also in your workplace. One of the most fantastic things about working at Steam Clock Software is being able to turn around to Alan Pike, who is one of the co-founders, and be like, hey, so I have this ridiculous sounding JavaScript idea and or question, and then we just go to the whiteboard and talk about it with like no weirdness about it. Like I know that it's not always easy for some people in their jobs to do that, but if you can't do that in your job, try and find another job where you can do that. You will become a better programmer. Suggestion 7, program a lot. Suggestion 8, stop fucking programming sometimes. You need breaks, okay? You like to think you can code 24/7. Your brain doesn't work that way. It needs breaks. That's why when you are trying to fall asleep or you're in the shower, bam, you'll know how to fix that bug. You need time away from the computer. Suggestion 9, write JavaScript a lot. Suggestion 10, write in another language for a while, actually. I mean, you should probably be writing mostly in JavaScript, but if you get outside your comfort zone a little bit and start comparing JavaScript with other languages, you'll find that there are a lot of little nuances to JavaScript that maybe you didn't know, and programming in another language exercises the brain, much in the way that learning another spoken language would, in a sense. Number 11, think like a programmer when AFK. People think I'm really weird for optimizing my route when I go to IKEA and figuring out the optimal way to get through it as fast as possible. And that might be silly to some of you, but that's great. You should be doing those sorts of thought exercises as much as you possibly can, because that exercises the logical part of your brain, which is largely, well, that's what you need for programming. And suggestion 12, know what good feedback is and reject all else. It turns out that some people aren't very happy with themselves and they will take it out on you. So sometimes on the internet, someone will reply to your question or your post. And honestly, if they're not being constructive and they throw in epithets or they say something mean, tone is a bit of a variable one, then honestly, if you're not getting anything constructive out of it, probably it's a waste of your time. There will be someone else who can give you constructive criticism. So just know how to differentiate between good feedback and troll feedback. The last one, really, that's a suggestion, is to break free of imposter syndrome. It just so happens that if you write code, you are a programmer, the end, relative of your ability. People that come out of the beginner JavaScript courses that I teach tell me that they want to be, quote, a real programmer one day. And I ask them, okay, well, are you writing code? Yeah, no, I'm writing code every day. Okay, great, you're a programmer. No, Angelina, I want to be a real programmer. And what they're actually trying to say is that they want to be good. And so hopefully if you are someone at home that gets to see this video and maybe you are in this nebulous intermediate zone, you will understand that yes, you are a programmer and your desire to want to be good is good, and you will get there, I promise, if you do some of these things. And I want you to fall in love with your process. I want you to fall in love with the balance between writing code and taking breaks. I want you to fall in love with the process of arguing your point and then taking the opposite position, because this sort of variety is what's going to help you grow as a person. It's going to expand your self-awareness and hopefully make you a better critical thinker about your programming. And so this is the end of my presentation. Thank you, wonderful humans, for inviting me to share. This has been JavaScript Masterclass, and I'm Angelina Fabbro. You can follow me on Twitter at Angelina Magnum. Questions by the pool. So that's it.